Launching the Antiquities Act of 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation, Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. The important purpose of this act was to preserve, for all Americans, significant pieces of the country's history. Ecology, geology, and beauty. But unlike America's great national parks, size is not important for monuments. Historic sites and other units of the national park system. Monuments are typically established by presidential proclamation, chosen as their personal memorials of the most special parts of this great country. However, occasionally these units of the park system are established by the direct action of Congress. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff, others next to none. And some eventually gain national park designation. America's treasures tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. It was the longest war in U.S. history. It was 60 years of ongoing battles, fights, and raids that took place between the Great Plains nomadic horse warriors on one side and settlers, traders, and the United States military on the other. With as many as 40,000 combined deaths, it made the Wild Wild West a dangerous and violent place. It was simply called the Great Indian Wars. The Great Indian Wars were a battle over who would control the central part of the United States. By the time settlers with their covered wagons began pushing west across Indian Territory to California and Oregon in the late 1830s, Native American nations had divided up the Great Plains. Present-day Texas and the desert Southwest were dominated and controlled by the fierce Comanche and Apache. The Southern Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho controlled the Central Plains, and the Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne reigned over the Northern Plains. The names of warriors who fought brilliantly in the Indian Wars are permanently etched in the American psyche. Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Roman Nose, Black Kettle, Tall Bull, Quanah Parker, Cochise, and Geronimo. As are the names of the generals and scouts who fought gallantly in that great war. Brigadier General George Crook, Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, General Nelson A. Miles, Buffalo Bill Cody, Kit Carson, and of course, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. 3 forts of the park system memorialize the glory and the tragedies during this pivotal time in American history. Fort Bowie National Historic Site in Arizona, Vent's Old Fort National Historic Site in Colorado, and Fort Laramie National Historic Site in Wyoming. One of the most critical sites in the development of the American West, Wyoming's Fort Laramie National Monument was officially established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on July 16, 1938. And on April 29, 1960, the old fort was declared a National Historic Site. Visitors to the fort are often surprised to find it is not enclosed by a wooden palisade. Instead, what they find is a large central parade ground surrounded by a number of historic military buildings. However, before the military buildings, there was one of the West's most famous mountain men trading posts, Fort William. Built in 1834 in a typical fort fashion, Fort William was enclosed by a palisade. In 1841, it was purchased by the American Fur Company. Then in 1849, it was purchased and its operations were taken over by the United States Army to protect the many wagon trains of migrant travelers on the Oregon and Mormon trails. However, when the Army arrived here, it felt no need for walled defensive measures. Indian warriors rarely attacked a garrison of armed soldiers and U.S. cavalry troops. As a result, the old Fort William crumbled away as the buildings we see today were constructed. Starting in 1849, the Army's mission at Fort Laramie changed many times over the next 41 years. From peacekeeping along the immigrant trails to the signing of the famous and some would say infamous peace treaties of 1851 and 1868 with the Indian tribes of the Northern Plains. And ultimately, the fort was the military base for the war to subjugate Northern Plains Indians. But throughout that time, Fort Laramie was always the setting for many historic events. Historic events that come to life during summer's Living History Days, as skits take place at many of the fort's iconic structures.
Fine-looking animals here.
Thank you. Yeah. You mean the horses? I thought you meant the engine here.
Well, how you doing this evening, sir?
Pretty good for an old engine.
I see. You're no reflection on yourself, huh?
I am a reflection off of the world.
So, how you been
Cool.
since that peace treaty signing?
Well, we didn't get much
And you
of
give
that.
us all them hills
Yeah. That's right. And I
with
hope
them
you,
gold in them.
and I hope you all fall off of them.
Imagine 2 wars being fought in our country.
Well, surely the Indians are no match for the Army.
Don't underestimate them. They're primitive, but they're determined. And I've seen them in battle twice. They're brutal and willing to take the needed risks. At Mud Springs, we wounded 30 of them, and they killed 15 of ours and wounded as many more.
Are they really as savage as they're said to be?
If you met one, you wouldn't think so. They joke, laugh, smile.
Oh, we need a big house. The boys will be here in 2 days.
I know it's not New York. The Hudson River balance here.
Evening, sir.
Captain, how are you?
Fine. Captain Provence, come to see.
Captain Covan, Major Helfrich. And my wife, Mrs. Helfrich.
Sir, this is my family, Mindy.
Sir,
Ma'am.
My oldest daughter, Jenna.
Miss.
My youngest daughter, Tressie.
Miss.
And our son, Ralph.
How do you do? You're going to be a soldier like your dad?
Yes, sir.
This time you're stealing chickens.
Stealing chickens?
Stealing chickens.
How many months or how many weeks do we get?
Oh, we got 30 days. 30 days hard labor.
If you're going to steal chickens, at least steal somebody's chickens that doesn't matter as much as the commanding officer.
Step forward. Close it up. Attention. Close it up. Right face. Forward. March.
Fort Laramie was also at the crossroads of America's westward expansion. As pioneers traveled the Oregon and Mormon trails on their way to the Pacific Coast and Utah. The first chapter in the battle for the Northern Plains began in 1845 when Colonel Stephen Kearny took 250 men in 5 companies of the 1st Dragoons across the plains, showing the flag, hoping to demonstrate the United States military might and superiority. In 1851, the Laramie Peace Treaty between the Northern tribes and the U.S. government established peace over the region. Immigrants and traders now traveled freely across the plains on the Oregon Trail. But peace was short-lived. In 1854, the Grattan Massacre near Fort Laramie set off a war between the U.S. and the Northern Plains Indians. Then in 1864, a 675-man force of Colorado U.S. Volunteer Cavalry massacred over 100 Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children at an event known as the Sand Creek Massacre. All-out war ensued across the plains. As a result, after the Civil War, the U.S. War Department revitalized the military on the plains by creating an additional 4 cavalry regiments for a total of 10. Cavalry regiments that eventually brought a war of total annihilation to the Northern Plains Indians, culminating in the 1890 Battle of Wounded Knee. Imagine it's 1840. An Arapaho or Southern Cheyenne Indian warrior has a buffalo hide he wishes to trade for provisions or bullets. This event took place many times at Bent's Old Fort. This was a brief time in the history of the American West, when whites and Indians on the Great Plains lived in a working harmony. Located in Colorado, Bent's Old Fort was made a historic site in 1960 by an act of Congress. Today, based on original drawings, it is one of the premier historic reconstructions in the park system. Built in 1833 by fur traders William and Charles Bent, the fort was a place where Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and fur trappers could bring their buffalo robes to exchange for money and provisions. At the time, the fort was heralded as the adobe castle on the plains. For the next 16 years, it became the American commercial hub along the Santa Fe Trail. It was a second home and safe haven for many of the West's most famous mountain men, scouts, and Indian fighters, including the illustrious Kit Carson. Entering the fort, the visitor is immediately transported to the sights and sounds of another time. The central open space is surrounded by rooms on all sides. Immediately on the left is the council room, a neutral place where chiefs could smoke their pipes, express grievances, and resolve problems. Next to the council room is the trade room, the place where business was done. The shelves would have been stocked with the most popular goods from back east. The kitchen at the back of the fort is where aromas from times long gone still bring your culinary senses alive. Adjacent to the kitchen is William Bent's room. William Bent was a singular man, a trapper, a trader, and an Indian agent extraordinaire. Here he lived with his Cheyenne wife, Owl Woman. Of particular interest is Susan McGoffin's quarters. Her remarkable diary, Down the Santa Fe Trail and Into Mexico, is one of the main sources of 1840s life in the American Southwest. She wrote of her quarters at Bent's Fort. Our room is quite roomy. You have two windows, one looking out on the plain, the other is on the patio. There are other rooms on the ground level, including a blacksmith's shop. Carpenter shop. Warehouses. And laborers' quarters. Upstairs, 3 rooms display living quarters for company employees and special guests. St. Vrain's quarters. As well as the clerk's quarters. On the upper level are also bastions. A watchtower. And a wonderful view of the animal corrals below at the back of the fort. Bent's Old Fort comes alive on Living History Days. Traders, trappers, cooks, workers, Native Americans, and dragoons tell the stories of their days of old at Bent's Fort. In fact, it was dragoons on their way to fight in the 1848 Mexican-American War, a war that spelled the end of Bent's Old Fort. The U.S. government, now needing military forts, tried to negotiate the purchase of the fort in 1849. But their bid was so low that it infuriated William Bent, and in a fit of rage, he blew up the fort. Fort Bowie National Historic Site in Arizona was authorized by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 30th, 1964, and formally established on July 28, 1972. The site tells the story of the battle for the desert Southwest between the Apache and the American settlers and the U.S. cavalry. The visitor's approach to Fort Bowie is like no other fort in the park system. You walk for 1.5 miles along a rough trail, past the remains of old outposts, a cemetery, an Apache spring. You get a complete understanding and feel for the landscape and what the people, both soldiers and Apaches, had to live through before you even reached the ruins at the park. Ruins because no attempt has been made to restore or rebuild the original buildings. The climb to the ruins takes the visitor through the dry Sonoran Desert. Approximately halfway up, you come upon the ruins of one of the 240 stations spaced along the 2,800-mile-long Butterfield Overland Mail route from St. Louis to San Francisco. A short distance up the trail, you can experience the ghostly Fort Bowie Post Cemetery. Here, ghosts speak of the terrible war and deaths between the Americans and the Apaches, which includes the grave of the Apache warrior Geronimo's son. Further up the trail stands another group of ruins. The ruins of the Chiricahua Apache Indian Agency. Originally built in 1869, here the esteemed U.S. Indian agent Thomas Jefford governed around 900 Chiricahua Apaches from 1875 to 1876. Off in the distance appears our first look at the ruins of Fort Bowie. Along the way, we encounter what made this historic piece of land so precious: Apache Spring. Apache Spring has a long history of use. Because the spring was the lifeblood of the Apache, a conflict arose between the great Apache leader Cochise and the California militia. Ironically, Fort Bowie may never have been built here except for the water. At last, the fort ruins are nearby. The fort before you was built in 1876, at the beginning of what is now called Geronimo's War. During the war, Fort Bowie was a combat hub for military operations against the Chiricahua Apache. The post even reached a population of 304 men during this time, when the usual strength of the post was about 150 men. It wasn't until the Chiricahua surrendered in September 1886 that Fort Bowie settled down to enjoy some of the amenities of life. The fort boasted corrals and stables, a quartermaster storehouse, a post trader, a school, an adjutant's office, infantry barracks, officers' row, a commanding officer's quarters, a new hospital and steward's quarters, a tailor shop, cavalry barracks, and mess halls and kitchens. Fort Bowie closed October 17, 1894. Exploration of the ruins is an exciting adventure in itself. Everything hundreds of men needed to survive in the hostile desert is lying in ruin here. a grand reward for the long trek up the mile-and-a-half trail. 8 years before the fort closed on September 4th, 1886, the great Apache warrior Geronimo surrendered in Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. After fighting for his homeland for almost 30 years, he was the last American Indian warrior to formally surrender to the United States. The great Indian Wars were over.